Before I go into the line-by-line breakdown of the Stanford MBA What Matters essay, I want to introduce a concept called story archetypes. Story archetypes are not necessarily templates, but they are structures that get repeated across cultures, across times, in mythology, and even in MBA application essays. For example, in 2019-20, one of the story archetypes applicants from the oil and gas industry used to share was a kind of a revelation about their journey that they're not fit for serving in the oil and gas industry because they could see the immorality of serving an industry where they are contributing to climate change, or they are contributing to the destruction of flora and fauna, or they are contributing to the destruction of local communities. This was the story archetype that used to appear in MBA application essays in 2019-20. Interestingly, they used to work really well. As the admissions team became aware of the story archetype and they could see the pattern immediately, applicants also pivoted slowly to a different story archetype. So I want to share one such story archetype with the sample Stanford MBA What Matters essay that I've shared in F&GMAT. This is a first draft, so don't copy any of the sample essays I'm sharing in F&GMAT's MBA essay review library. This is just for educational purposes, so early, don't copy it. So the applicant's background, he is a reservoir engineer working for ExxonMobil. He's a 28-year-old domestic US applicant, 5 years of experience in Houston. His stretch schools are Harvard Business School and Stanford. His matching schools are Rice Jones, McCombs, Booth, and MIT. Now, his post-MBA goal is to enter into energy finance. Currently, he is a reservoir engineer, so he has to work in oil rigs. He has to face all these dilemmas. But the story archetype in 2026 is not about the ethical dilemma an applicant is facing. It's about safety. So I have noticed this pattern emerging a lot. And also the societal impact of towns still depending on oil and gas infrastructure to serve their communities. So we saw that recently when the war in Iran started, how it affected inflation, how it increased the prices of essential goods and services, not just in Southeast Asia, even in the US, where there is surplus oil and gas supply. This is the current mood of the world. So when you write any Stanford MBA What Matters or any essay where you have to highlight your values, you have to capture something that matches the current mood of the global economy or the global community. Here is what I start with. What matters most to me is to bring sustainable and affordable energy to future generations. Now, this is a cliched line you will see applicants use constantly. But when you're stuck with any opening line and you're not moving forward, it's always better to start with a cliched or generic opening line, because you have this opportunity to improve the line in the next 2-3 sentences. So what's the next sentence? Over the years, I have become good at creating models that spot oil reserves 2 miles below the rocks. I didn't have much of a choice. Think of opening lines as chess moves. So when you start a chess game, the opening moves are around pawns. So these are ordinary pawns. You're not showing any brilliance. You're just opening the cliched moves, 1 or 2 cliched moves. But then the second, third, and fourth moves are what makes it interesting. Now look at the second and third line again. Over the years, I have become good at creating models that spot oil reserves 2 miles below the rocks. Now, this is another rehashing of the resume, which applicants are discouraged from using. I constantly tell them not to rehash their resume. But when you start with a cliched opener, a rehashing of a resume, now the admissions person's interest in your story is slowly going down. Then you have to bring in the hook. You have to start with a line that builds intrigue in your story. So what is that line? I didn't have much of a choice. What does the applicant mean by I didn't have much of a choice? Is it because he's stuck in his job? Is he noticing a problem with the employer or the industry or the customer he's serving? So you have to now the interest in the story has begun. The admissions person will definitely read the next sentence. This is a strategy where you start with an intriguing line and then go back to a flashback or a history. From the moment my grandfather kept his first drill bit on the mantle, I would shadow around his drill work and name the parts of the pump jack before I could name half the state capital. So the story starts with a cliched opening line with a resume rehashing, but then it goes into an interesting curiosity building line and then goes back to a flashback about his time with his grandfather. Now it gets interesting. I was only 5, but the barrel of oil meant so much to my grandfather. His father, a rancher who had given up on the cotton sale, woke up one day collecting a check that erased all his debt and kept some more for my grandpa. He bought the adjacent ranch with that single lucky exploration. The royalty was 1/8 in those days. Grandpa took me to these dry oil wells on our land with gleaming eyes. So the story shifts from the applicant to his grandfather. Whenever you introduce a secondary character, you have to talk about them relative to you. You should not create a narrative just about the grandfathers. If you read the line, you will see how I've cleverly kept the applicant in the loop. See, I was only 5, but the barrel of oil meant so much to my grandfather. It's not, we don't need to connect the applicant with the grandfather and connect his age, but we are connecting every sentence. His father, a rancher who had given up on the cotton sale, woke up one day and collecting a check that erased all his debt and kept some more for my grandpa. So this is a strategy where the applicant is sharing how the community used to thrive by depending on oil and gas industry. He bought the adjacent ranch with that single lucky exploration. So he's highlighting the role of luck in exploration. So there are 2 sentences where the applicant is not connected to his grandpa through any sentences. Again, the 3rd sentence where he's not mentioned. The royalty was 1/8 in those days. Grandpa took me to these dry oil wells on our land with gleaming eyes. Now, again, the line came back to the applicant. So there are 3 sentences in this paragraph where the applicant is not mentioned, but he quickly brings himself to the story. So this is a strategy you have to apply. You have to bring yourself into the story. Don't just talk about a secondary character, even if it's your loving grandfather. Now, I proudly continued the legacy of changing lives and communities in Texas. The story archetype is not about guilt or the ethical dilemma. The story archetype is about legacy, the legacy of changing communities and lives in Texas with the oil and gas industry. Energy independence meant the farmers and ranchers don't have to worry about the input cost. This is another strategy or a pattern used by applicants who are working in the oil and gas industry. They are showing the value of oil and gas industry in reducing the cost of producing or manufacturing. This is highly relevant now as the US policy has been to bring manufacturing to the country. You have to write storylines that are relevant for what is happening right now. Now the applicant talks about his work. My work on a recovery model extended the exploration of the Permian Basin field by 9 years. So this is the high impact achievement or the rehashing of the resume that the applicant is doing. Now, ideally don't rehash your resume, but when your story has so many themes around communities, about the legacy of oil and gas industry, the importance of oil and gas industry in reducing input costs for manufacturing and farming, you have to bring your story or rehash the resume into the essay. There is no other way out because this is the most important achievement. My work on a recovery model extended the exploration of the Permian Basin field by 9 years. So you are guaranteeing 9 years of cash flow for this company. That same afternoon, my sister sent me a photograph. What the story archetype does, like many of the story archetypes, is that you bring a positive news and a negative news simultaneously. This is an interesting story archetype where the reader will feel mixed emotion. The person is happy for the applicant getting that work recognized, but now the reader is feeling curious. What is happening? What is the photograph that the sister sent him? A gutted pump jack, the one grandpa treasured. This is a classic storytelling tool to keep the audience interested in the story. What storytellers do is that they make the object the focus of the story. And this doesn't happen in the opening line. This typically happens somewhere in the first 1/3 or the middle of the essay. So what is the object here? Pump jack. Pump jack represents something. What it is representing? It represents the community's reliance on oil and gas. The pump jack was gutted. You go to the next line. I was devastated. The hours of my childhood memories were no longer recoverable. Worst 144,000 acres across the panhandle in February 2024 were charred to the ground. Suddenly, from a legacy of oil and gas industry, from what the applicant's connection was to the oil and gas industry and communities, his relationship with his grandpa, his achievement strategically included in the essay, all pivots to a devastation. Wind-reduced fire, which started at an oil field in Moore County on the same afternoon as Smokehouse Creek, began at the ignition point of a pump jack, which was powered through faulty wires. So what was happening? Why the fire spread so widely? And that fire caused the pump jack to be gutted. When the wind moved the limbs against the energized lines, the contact ignited a spark. In storytelling, when you feel that the story is getting a little stale, you introduce setbacks, you introduce tragedies to hook the reader to your story. So this is one such strategy. Two strategies actually. The person uses an object, the pump jack, and then pivots to a devastation, wildfire destroying that pump jack. So it's a symbolic sign that his childhood memory is being destroyed by the fire. Instead of moral dilemma or ethical dilemma, the story is showing the lack of safety in oil exploration in these marginalized communities because the community relied too long on oil and gas industry for their living. The next line shows clearly what the applicant is trying to convey. When unregulated greed is passed along as opportunities in communities, devastation follows. So this is a stand the applicant is taking that it's not a moral or ethical dilemma. It is greed, unregulated greed. Why is saying that it's unregulated greed? The essay explains it. The pump jack's power lines were wired by oil and gas operators outside the state's purview, so it was an unregulated wiring. After the oil boom, the communities were looking for any source of income to sustain the legacy of these once oil-rich towns. It didn't matter if they were illegal. I had to think beyond my individual accomplishments. What was it doing for my community? I had become good at integrating systems and processes that limit carbon emission in our exploration and kept 100% safety record in our oil rigs. But for communities spread outside the federal purview, safety is secondary. The applicant is talking about safety as the focus of the essay. Communities that depended too long on the oil and gas industry is now facing serious devastation because safety is secondary. Although the applicant is maintaining 100% safety record in oil rigs, his communities can't afford to prioritize safety because they rely on a declining oil and gas industry. If you read the next paragraph, you will understand. Attending the emission reduction working group, I learned that the same reservoir modeling used to find oil could locate the best rock for storing carbon dioxide underground with a technique called sequestration. Applicant is talking about a cutting-edge technology. I propose a small change to how we schedule well completions to cut flaring and store carbon underground. It was approved for 2 fields and refused for a third on cost. Now the applicant is pivoting from the community to a factor that is affecting the oil and gas industry. Cost. Unless the costing part is taken care of, you will see more and more communities relying on unregulated oil refining companies to explore their land. This is a factor that applicant is highlighting. The same cost excuse let the unregulated oil explorers cut corners and burn down my grandpa's legacy. He's talking about a problem that is prevalent in his community, that is unregulated oil explorers. The next line is what brings the focus back to why the applicant care about the local communities, why the applicant care about the oil and gas industry. So whenever you write long, more than 500-word essay, you have to keep bringing back your story and your motivation into the line. Sometimes you have to explicitly say what your motivation is, like the next line. I'm the fourth generation of my family to make a living from this land. So he has deep connection with this land. He can't bear to see his land being destroyed because of unregulated oil exploration. Cost, a variable I have no influence over, is everything in the energy business. I need skills I do not have yet to allocate capital in energy storage and create risk frameworks that protect communities. So his why Stanford MBA goal is subtly hinted with this line. So he's not going to expand on this line, but the MBA admissions team read the what matters and why Stanford MBA essay together. So you can use certain hints in the what matters essay about your motivation and then expand on it with the why Stanford MBA essay, where you go into the specifics about creating a risk framework or requiring cost controls and capital in energy storage. Here I've used two clauses. What typically applicants use is they start with what matters most to me, a particular line, a particular value statement, and end with the same line or a rephrased line that shows your value. Here, I've used two clauses. Why? Because the applicant has multiple motivation. So the first closer is what matters most to me is to protect the land and the sea that has given me so much. So it's a legacy of protecting the communities that has given so much for the applicant. Then the next closer shows the motivation for a Stanford MBA. The time has come to create the financial framework to bring sustainable energy to future generations. He's hinting that although he has been excellent in deploying carbon capture technology or reducing emissions, he knows that it is not enough if you have to create a safe community that can rely on sustainable energy. So this sustainable energy can be with oil and gas industry, with renewable energy, or a mix of oil and gas and renewable energy, where the safety of the community comes first. For that, he has to think about cost structures. He has to think about risk frameworks. And for this, he doesn't have the skills right now. He's an engineer. So that is why he's pursuing a Stanford MBA. Now, this is how you connect all your story elements into one What Matters essay. You have to leave enough scent of information in the What Matters essay around your motivation so that you can expand on it in the Why Stanford MBA essay. I hope you got value from it. This is just the first draft I've written to illustrate the concept of story archetypes. This is the new archetype in 2026 when we are dependent on both oil and gas and renewable energy. And as AI becomes prevalent, you need more energy and we can't completely rely on oil and gas. You need a mix of energy and you can't completely rely on renewable. Again, this mix of energy is what we need, and a lot of applicants is going to accept this reality and show it in their narrative. So you have to go beyond the 2019-20 story archetype of moral or ethical dilemma. That is not the reality right now. Craft your What Matters or Why Stanford MBA essay with the reality of the current market. If you need my help, subscribe to F1GMAT's essay editing service at store.f1gmat.com/essay-editing. Or you can reach out to me at editor@f1gmat.com.